Hello everyone, today we read the third paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege, the title being Dann, Taktik tried to find its way in the same direction. The text follows. Afterwards, Taktik attempted to give to the mechanism of its joints the character of a general disposition, built upon the peculiar properties of the instrument, which character leads indeed to the battlefield, but instead of leading to the free activity of mind, leads to an army made like an automaton by its rigid formations and orders of battle, which, movable only by the word of command, is intended to unwind its activities like a piece of clockwork. So, another short paragraph today. They will keep coming like this for a long time now, but I think it's fine to treat them individually because they're very meaningful. They start touching on certain specific military historical topics, even though in a kind of a generic way, which is general and generic, but still, pretty meaningful. In the last video, we have explained also in the previous two videos, basically from the beginning of the second chapter, how von Clausewitz was presenting this evolution of the art of war, strictly meant as in an evolutionary perspective, historically speaking, or in a kind of diachronic perspective in general, meaning that also in here there is no real teleology. Things didn't have to evolve the way they did, but they evolved, they kind of transformed the way they did because there was a reason and some kind of evolution can be seen in this perspective, meaning that there's been objectively an improvement, an expansion, a growth, and therefore also a complication in the system, and therefore this specific, the latter element has brought to the necessity of conceiving, an art of war properly meant, aside from the preparation of the armed forces. And von Clausewitz, we've seen it in the last video, he says that the true war meant as this art of war in its directioning function appeared first in the art of sieges, right? This is important as we have explained why, fundamentally, and in part it was because of the inner problems, the inner limitations that siege warfare had before the development of firearms, and how it's from this, from the development also of artillery, and as a consequence of military engineering, that a new theoretical guide starts being developed, right? The idea that now we have really to make actual calculations on how things have to develop. More than that, there is a combination that von Clausewitz has defined as this strictly a material dimension of approaches, trenches, counter-approaches, batteries, etc., that more than resembling at the beginning such intellectual spin-off that often happened kind of not really at the epiphenomenal level, but if not etymologically meant like something that stood at the top of this strictly material and artistical, we can say, in fact, in the sense of ability and craftsmanship developments, starts developing. So this, as a consequence, says. Started developing as kind of a accelerated, in a kind of a fashion was not substantially different from before, but that just changed initially in its rhythms more than it's strictly in quality. We have been talking a lot in the previous von Clausewitz video on the importance of the in a correct historical perception of war. Those times, how objectively wasn't much of a difference, even after the introduction of firearms, in how warfare was practically developed. Also, he realized that some of the greatest, the accomplishment of certain, for example, not just in siege warfare, but think about even the development of linear tactics in open field, right? Something that took literally 200 years before it was fully developed, from pike squares to lines of musketeers. Same went a little bit also in field fortification. At one point, this fortifications didn't become useless at all, but they didn't become the most important thing. Like at the beginning of the modern age, still a very imposing fortress could make a huge difference in broad strategical theaters. The more time progresses, and the more this importance is shifted on armies proper, right? So that's what happens in here, or at least that's what von Clausewitz is referring to in the third paragraph. And he introduces it already from the title in this fascinating perspective, because it says, by reconnecting to the previous title, says, true war first appears in the art of sieges, then tactics tried to find its way in the same direction, right? Tried because, of course, this was something extra. It wasn't just about material means, like the art of sieges had transformed into, because the art of sieges, of course, entailed much more than just material thinking, but it was mostly related to also the developments of certain geometrical proportions, certain spatial conceptions, not necessarily the human factor involved. Like, it was calibrated largely on the base of how a cannon could shoot, and what resistance of these particular fortresses could be as a consequence, etc. With tactics, with armies, the thing starts to be a bit more complicated, because at that point you have to deal not with static objects, but with men, ultimately, that have to be led and have to be framed under a command that has to be dynamic on the field, and finding solutions that, even if they are not static, are not just based on material factors, let's say, and that therefore is much more fluctuating, also as a theory. Naturally, as here von Clausewitz is probably referring to, there was an effort for this process to happen, meaning that initially, if you look at modern warfare, naturally also tactics corresponded a little bit ideally to this geometrical proportions, meaning that even the squares of pikemen, and how the lines of arquebusiers and later musketeers had to be intersected, and how all these elements had to cooperate, was dealt with initially in a kind of a geometrical fashion. I mean, it wasn't much about understanding the truest nature. We're always talking about a level of treatise, right? Not really what happened on the field, because what happened on the field, there was a practical know-how that went beyond this. But really in treatises, and therefore in this kind of, not really abstraction, but in this eminently theoretical field, was this idea that even formations corresponded to certain geometrical patterns, for example. That is cool, if you think about it. It obviously emerges from this achievement of disposing for the first time after forever now, from times that were completely lost. In fact, were trying to be recovered, like ancient warfare. This possibility, the availability of thousands of troops that you could take, recruit, equip, train, with enormous resources that during the Middle Ages hadn't been there, because there was no centralized state that could really field even permanently this kind of troops. So at this point there is this kind of hype deriving from this new wealth, if you want, and noticing that naturally with this trained troops, you could do a lot of things, a lot of evolutions, a lot of maneuvers, and different exercises that gave the hope, at least in certain milieu, that were definitely intersected with the ones that were sometimes overlapping, also with the same ones that of the people who actually led these troops from the very field of battle, that could, bring to this ideal forms of how an army had to fight, and how, finding the perfect solution, right? So this, what we can find a kind of a positivistic approach to reality. I mean, the idea that reality had to tend, like geometrical proportions, to the infinite, and to this utmost human exertion towards that direction. Naturally, von Clausewitz writes after, at this point, not so distantly from there, but looking at it in perspective from centuries of massive development, of massive debate, even relatively to these matters, and especially after the 18th century, that, as we will see afterwards, had been a bit, not really the peak, it was actually a moment of crisis of those conceptions proper, but had also produced, paradoxically, a type of warfare that was arguably, albeit this is also a bit of a prejudice, a bit, sclerotized, or, however, that had brought to, especially in the first part, to this kind of stall of tactical developments, right? Much had changed under Frederick II of Prussia, and obviously von Clausewitz, that was fresh memory, as even Napoleon had, it was fresh memory, obviously, for Prussians, from Prussian military, where von Clausewitz came from, but, it was fresh memory also in the sense that the Prussians themselves had been defeated by Napoleon, that was a great admirer of Frederick II, had obviously studied his own tactics, and will consider himself kind of his continuator. Always bear this in mind. The great military commanders and what we call military geniuses, etc., often had their own model. We're trying to emulate someone else. It was even the case of Napoleon. Was definitely one of the greatest military minds of his time. And that had a bit unhinged, however, especially during Napoleonic Wars, all these preconceptions of how war in the 18th century had to be, based, in fact, more on political and social changes rather than strictly military one, that naturally, as we know, especially in Clausewitzian theory, follow directly to the first. So what am I really talking about? We will explain at the end, because with the metaphor of the clockwork and the machine, that's kind of more, and that's exactly what von Clausewitz is referring to. Starting to read here, the first phrase has, afterwards tactics attempted to give to the mechanism of its joints the character of a general disposition. And, oh damn, this is a whole long phrase. I realized this just right now, that the whole paragraph was actually a big phrase. So let's tear it down piece by piece. So let's tear it down. Let's split it piece by piece and explain in it. So this first part, afterwards tactics attempted to give to the mechanism of its joints the character of a general disposition, right? So there is this initial attempt to, in fact, highlight, at least in part, not necessarily to dispose effectively on the field, because what is theory is one thing, what is the practice obviously is another one. There is a middle ground, but things definitely change in some ways. So the concept in here is that it was possible to play a little bit. Consider this, that as we were saying before, modern tactics evolved rather slowly, right? Yeah, if you take medieval standards, they were evolving like crazy, right? They were accelerating like crazy. But objectively, as we were saying before with Pike&Shot tactics, for example, That is what is in this Western perspective also von Clausewitz had in mind. Things were very, very attempted since the beginning. There was no immediate or clear understanding whether, what direction things had to take. There was, as a moment, it was roughly during the mid of the 16th century in which cavalry reached its minimum in terms of tactical effectiveness, so much that it had been largely, albeit not completely, confined to this caracal tactics that were basically skirmishing in the front line and to soften up the enemy ranks and hopefully still charging into them. There was sometimes there is this idea that caracal tactics were all that existed at the time of their use. It's not really so for cavalry. And it's not really like that. Obviously there was no even real reform, right? These were tactics were carried out. Even they were invented, obviously, at one point, but they were conceptually present in all the combination of firearms plus cavalrymen, right? So it's not really a big deal, but they weren't everything, right? And there wasn't even a real standardization in the sense proper, like every army kind of operated like they wanted, right? The most famous, many people credit the Germans for caracal tactics, which is partly true because the Germans were in the 16th century one of the few countries that had the actual technology for producing wheel-lock pistols that were fundamentally accelerating that process. So this idea that they were kind of much and faster to reload, albeit they were very expensive. That's also why that tactics at the end of the day didn't quite take off, and eventually things redeveloped in another direction, and not just because of the of different technology, but also, of other types of technology, including the development of musketry fire, so the reduction in effectiveness of pikes. So it's a bit like rock, scissors, paper, and all these factors intervene on each other. But and then there is a progressive, in fact, increase in musketry and the progressive dissolution of pike formations. Every country differed into this. There were areas of Europe where this basically didn't happen. If you look especially at Eastern Europe, there was from one side the emulation of the West, from one side a lot of ethnical elements still remaining and having kind of even anachronisms of success, like the Polish winged hussars that were even capable of outreaching with their lances the the Western pikes, so that they were able to charge into Swedish pikemen that were completely Westernized in model, and winning, right? Things like that. This obviously was complicated, but in the West, if you're sticking to the West, where naturally Pike&Shot tactics were most developed, there weren't excessive options. Much of the debate, even with Maurice of Nassau and all, was about what's the right proportion of pikes and muskets at that point. Even the development of artillery was a pretty long and very slow business. The same, all the various tactical combination and how to shape the formations, the size of the units, was something that in fact it took a lot of time, but was also taking finally certain more consistent, more meaningful tactical directions, meaning that at this point such problems from even military treatises were starting to become real. Like, objectively, there was a way, it was definitely obvious that there was a way to rationalize this let's say, to equilibrate this tactical ratio in order to maximize the effects, on the field. And yet it began very slow, right? And still, as von Clausewitz stresses in here, built upon the peculiar properties of the instrument, right? So it wasn't much of a of an omnicomprehensive perception of how armies had to be led from the field as armies proper, because still, like the like every specialist, every NCO, whoever was deputed to certain, to supplies, to upkeeping of the troops, to the encampment, already knew what they had to be doing, right? And even on the field, fundamentally units functioned the way they had to, simply because there was even some, the professional, semi-professional figures who knew how it had to be done. So also at this point, there was still a great distance between the full understanding of the tactical spectrum and its theorization in manuals and treatises, right? And this passage, in fact, took a lot of time. The one who made sensible improvements in this way in the second half, in the 17th century was Montecuccoli, that also von Clausewitz read avidly, and then eventually von Clausewitz who really made the big difference, the last step, fulfilled completely this general understanding of what the whole problem was in the first place, right? Obviously, we're skipping many steps in the process of explaining this thing, but the main conceptual changes really stemmed from this, right? And some of them, in fact, they went looking like from the top, this mostly theoretical view of war from Machiavelli to increasingly higher attention towards details and how armies properly function on the field, right? And dealing with morale, etc. Even in this, and what is interesting about this is that von Clausewitz is stressing the continuation in the process, from the beginning at least, with the strictly material dimension of the story, right? Here it says the tactics attempted to give them to mechanisms joints the character of a general disposition, so something that had to be usually employed on the field, but was still built upon the peculiar properties of the instrument. That is to say, in fact, pike does that, musket does that, artillery does that, cavalry does that. So it wasn't really conceived as a broader dynamism of what tactic could be. It was still this idea that, for example, the battle array formations had to be something preset, right? And we can't blame them, right? This is also important. I never make it a question of positivistic ideals. The same von Clausewitz rejected this and then never embraced this. There was no point. His whole theory is built against this concept. But it's important also because it makes you understand objectively what were the intrinsic tactical limits of those times, right? With a 16th century army, you can't objectively have, and you don't even need in the first place, to have a sophisticated understanding of what tactics is and all what because the chunks of the army that you have are fundamentally they're limited in their capability, right? Even the pike square is initially conceived, in spite of its offensive capabilities, largely like a sort of moving fortress by certain standards, or even a static fortress sometimes, around which cavalry had to operate and other missile troops had to function. So there is still this idea of bringing almost the fortress in open field, right? So that there is a safe place where you can stand. This had always been the case, actually, even in other armies, meaning the concept of the banner, of the thickly packed formation, that you can also easily identify on the field, and here the advancements in tactical theory correspond to the slow dynamicization of the system that, however, at this point was still overwhelmed by the physical limits of these formations, right? So even this debate was fundamentally about how do I to combine ideally on the field this thing. There was also a lot of imitation of Roman models, right? There were even massive failures dictated by this. Like, there were more than strictly tactical failures, also organizational failures. Like, think about the French legions of pikemen that Francis I at one point wanted to institute, because he wanted to emulate the Roman armies of the ancient world. And these weren't much good for much. They were disbanded, eventually left just as garrisons, because in that case, in France, the political and social condition, state of things didn't quite fit for a solid infantry production. The French were best in cavalry, in artillery, but they sucked at infantry, so they had to bring the Swiss in. And there were all reasons, right? So also the Swiss fundamentally were good only at infantry. And there are also definitely many, now in simplifying, especially talking about the very first beginning of the 16th century, where kind of every nation had its own tactical specialties, right? But especially with the model of the Spanish tercio, what you find is a bit the combination of all these elements, right? That probably also with Gonzalo de Cordova brings to modern warfare properly meant, right? Always remember, the Spanish commander Gonzalo de Cordova was literally the greatest commander of the modern age. He's not often mentioned because we lost our minds, into other levels and perspectives, often towards the end of the modern age. But actually, the founder and the greatest, the founder and greatest commander of the modern age is Gonzalo de Cordova, El Gran Capitan, just for understanding what I'm talking about. And from there on, like, Western tactics start to homogenize fundamentally, right? You can identify this solid Western bulk of that. Sometimes it's also, this perspective is interesting because there is an acceleration of the differences sometimes between certain models and others, right? In fact, based on politics and societies, always, when were these armies stemming from at the end of the day? We're stemming from centralized states, right? It was Spain, it was France, chiefly, and other states had similar things that, however, were finally producing kind of a systemic, let's say, control of the armed forces, right? It would take a lot of time before this was fully achieved. Actually, the first ones who started achieving it properly were the French in the second half, from the second half of the 17th century with Louis XIV. So that from there on, we can talk about something very, very different, where you have an army that is properly styled professional army, point, end of the story. It's not the mercenary professional army, though, that, however, you don't quite control. This naturally is a long process that has to do with the increase of capabilities of tax collections, and increase also. The colonialism had to do with this also a lot. But I mean, the European states were also largely, fundamentally, based on their own individual part, especially in the case of France, actually. They were not really depending much of external resources, but in this sense were developing. And it's not a case that France especially was the land that saw these major improvements, especially in terrestrial armies. There is a reason for that. It's also the same kind of geographical character of France, its neighbors, the situation in general. So we will all deal with this stuff sooner or later. But always bearing in mind that up to, in fact, the second half of the 17th century, even recruiting an army was something not really exceptional, because there were always kind of many armies out there in many ways. But if there was a long period of peace, that was definitely quite rare. However, there was no point in maintaining more than just, let's say, royal household troops, and maintaining these other levies or mercenary companies that were still there at the end of the day. So even when, and this influenced the same, and limited indeed, the development of a tactical theory. Because one thing is having an army that finally has its own headquarters and academic training and statal funding and in this constant and truly professional character. One thing is an army that you recruit every once in a while that maybe has a bulk of highly efficient troops that you pay as a sovereign, etc., to be faithful to you, but that really are not more than a medium private arm, medium small private army, and then other elements are kind of different because at this point even the battlefields start becoming say object of study, right? Exactly for this positive sense. Also because war was being always more expensive. So the real problem was that when you fielded these big armies that at this time were big because of the strategic limits of the Middle Ages with the development of firearms had kind of fallen with the demolition fortresses, etc. Armies were always larger and more expensive, and therefore you really wanted to organize them better, given the fact it was still somewhat exceptional to levy them, to raise them, and therefore to operate them. So that's when a big battle that had become kind of the norm at this point could really make a big difference, right? There is never the the strategical speed like battles from the Middle Ages were still largely undecisive in many wars. I mean, some of the greatest battles of the modern age that were even when they were kind of very decisive, tactically speaking, they weren't really at a strategical level because the states lacked often the means to push forwards, right, to protract this enormous military expense, given the still fragile nature of their of their centralized states and bureaucracy and resources in general. But this starts triggering something, right? And in fact, here von Clausewitz says that this general disposition that tactics attempted to create on the base of mechanism of its joints and this peculiar properties of the tactical instrument are brought as a character indeed to the battlefield, right? So they start making some difference on battlefield, but as von Clausewitz says, quote, instead of leading to the free activity of the mind, leads to an army made like an automaton by its rigid formations and orders of battle. This is very, very important. So, and continuing till the end of the phrase, it says, which movable only by the word of command is intended to unwind its activities like a piece of clockwork, right? Maybe we will discuss it later, but this first part is very, very important. So it is true that there is a difference now that the tactical theory does in starting to develop an art of war properly meant, but these armies on the field still maintain rigid formations and orders of battle. Right? Von Clausewitz calls them like automatons. And therefore, he says that there is a lack of the free activity of mind. That is to say, and this explains also a lot, even in he will do it later. Excuse me, I drink a little bit. In making certain You remember, I don't remember which passage it was of the first book, when von Clausewitz said that certain peoples could objectively not produce military geniuses, not because they lacked kind of the human material, but they effectively lacked the intellectual development that is required to have such understanding. Well, this is a bit exactly the same thing. When you have an army that is so difficult to make it move, that doesn't have this great tactical dynamic potential, you also are relatively passive to the way a combat goes on, right? This is no joke. Like, all war is really pretty messy and chaotic and confused, and most of what happens in the battlefield is objectively unknown to the same commander. Never think that if you participate to a battle, you can effectively understand what went on. Like, in order to understand what really that battle unfolded like, tactically speaking. These battles were a mess. Just think one factor, for example, the smoke on the fields. Right before the 70s, if I'm not wrong, of the 19th century, you have to imagine that battlefields, after the first volley of fire, were basically like, it was mist. You didn't see anything in there. This is widely known. Like, it's no mystery for anyone who understands at least a little bit of military history. So what's the chance at this point? That is kind of a big factor of visibility, right? If anything, at this point, firearms are developing, so yeah, they're paradoxically the same ones that produce this limitation, but you have to point and aim at someone to shoot. It's obvious that these formations, and up to the second half of the 19th century, didn't quite, the soldiers didn't quite aim at a single enemy. They just aimed at the wall, at the enemy formation in general, right? There was not this, with a smoothbore barrel, there was no way to aim, pretending to hit, like at more than some, several tens of meters, to literally hit the target you were aiming at, right? So all this brought to certain mechanisms on the field that objectively limited your action, that rendered that action, that dynamism, that development of that can bring to a free activity of the mind, unhinged by these limits, in place, right? This was a big problem, and it was one of those hot topics back in the day, especially in von Clausewitz's times at this point, because they had fully recognized the problem. The revolving 18th century warfare, that's what I want to bring you to, because that's when actually there was a big deal of tactical development, right? Early 18th century armies are still substantially different from early 19th century armies, right? A lot has changed. And therefore, in this change, in fact, had already occurred from the second half of the 18th century, and definitely with the Napoleonic Wars that had really changed a freaking lot of things. But there was a mindset in here that had to be unhinged. It was a mindset that was tied also to a certain conception of war, right? The idea is that, taking this perspective is also fascinating. War was not really a science, fortunately, it wasn't seen that way. And as we know very well by studying von Clausewitz, war is not a science, and it can never be by any standard, by definition, right? There is nothing like a science of war, there's just the art of war. There's nothing positivistic about war, you can make it turn into a science. Because 3/4 of what you have to do in there is unknown by definition. This is what von Clausewitz teaches. The real point here, though, is that war was seen more like a royal sport than an actual, as we conceive it today, like a national activity. Like at the beginning of the 21st century, we still reason in a way that it's fundamentally similar to what early 19th century was, right? At least in the revolutionary perspective, the idea that there is a state a nation, a community. War before was something different. It was still a matter of pride, of feudal mindset, and this idea of fealty and honor and loyalty that they were definitely ideal. There was nothing like that on the field, but that rendered warfare, in this sense, more of a clash between dynasties than an actual business of other social classes, right? Would it write about war? Well, obviously just noblemen, right? About war specifically, there was plenty of people who wrote about it, but it was either moralistic things or even something technical surely about it. But the real problem of war at that point was kind of starting to make sense of it, maybe on a more with a more scientific criterion, but still conceiving war as part of a broader lifestyle more than an object of analysis by detached from the not really detached, but kind of well describable on its own, identifiable as a separated thing from the others. So this is important because this also changes your mindset relatively to war. It also brings to a sort of laziness. The idea, war is like society. It's always the same, right? It never changes. We're always at the top as aristocrats. There's nothing, really that there are changes we can obviously we are aware of, but they're not so radical. They don't, go much into depth to what. It doesn't even require at this point to make an inquiry of what war really is from top to bottom. It's not a surprise that you have a von Clausewitz that appears as a writer, as a military theorist, after something like the Napoleonic Wars, that were the most devastating war ever existed in the history of humanity at that point. So, and that it was not really about just war, this aristocratic sport. It was really about the clash between that aristocratic model and something else. It was a kind of a revolutionary, republican, national, whatever you want to call it, model, right? That after the Restoration, by the way, were kind of rejoined, because even during the same Napoleonic Wars, the most reactionary countries were, including Prussia, and that's where von Clausewitz emerges from, in the sense, or Austria, or began to understand what the point was in terms of what the future war had to be. Maybe they didn't reason exactly in terms of future war, but they understood that in order to field the necessary resources and also the quality of the same, there had to be a completely different approach, not just to the military organization, but also to politics and society, and a complete rethinking of war in the first place. Hence you have von Clausewitz, right? Hence you have someone who at this point is really trying to understand war to its core from a philosophical point of view, that however has to serve also for practice, and that's where what the Vom Kriege is about in a nutshell. And it works. That's the thing, and it doesn't work like 80%. Like, it's literally what war is. End of the story. Let's say, going back of our 18th century warfare that we kind of skipped at this point. So what happens in modern warfare at this time is that between the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century, what we call linear tactics is fully mature, right? Basically there is the abandonment of pikes. Sometimes it's paradoxical how, for example, a few people know that it was actually France that abandoned the last pikes, despite France had been like the most developed military out there and the strongest one, but also the least technologically investing, let's say. And this also tells you a lot on how technology is basically a myth. It's all about doctrine, and technology without doctrine is totally useless. But and there is nothing you can do about that. So the eternal myth of technology is something that I personally kind of understood by a lot of time, but to many people, really, war is won by technology, and these people are regularly those who lose wars. In general, I'm not referring to any country in particular, but really to the mindset. It's the mindset that loses. And always remember, as von Clausewitz teaches, that it's not the strongest but the most intelligent that wins in war. That's where you need doctrine, right? You don't just need the big guns. You also need how to use them, and not literally mechanically, but how to employ them properly against an enemy, and which targets, which objective. That's the real point, right? So this abandonment of pikes had been abandoned because basically musketry fire had become so effective and accurate, and that there was no point in still maintaining pikes to stop cavalry. It was enough to have muskets right in the front. It's not that cavalry was rendered useless, as we were saying before. From the mid of the 16th century, cavalry kept increasing its own importance over time, and in fact in the 18th century it kind of comes back once again, because it's true, musketry fire can halt effectively certain cavalry charges if that are cavalry is normally few units, because they're still very costly, and you can employ them in contained numbers, and obviously you can attack. Infantry is much larger, so between bayonets and sheer fire, you can absorb cavalry charge, even if they impact in your own line, because you don't have pikes anymore. Still, you can absorb them kind of decently. Otherwise, you can still, cavalry has this standard employment, that is to attack at that point infantry that has lost part of its cohesion, and therefore you simply have to run through them like grass and butchering them down. Infantry remains the most important tactical arm at this point. It had been so since the 16th century, basically, fully, right? But cavalry comes back, and yet, then there is a development in artillery. Always bearing in mind that artillery is fundamentally not meant to actually kill people, but just to disrupt enemy formations, which is not the same thing, because you can disrupt people even just by using a ricochet fire, therefore making people freaking out, because instead of making cannonballs falling on their head from the sky, you make them see the ball actually bouncing in front of them, and therefore freaking out and realizing that and running around to avoid, and therefore especially from the front line where they can see it. So the guys who are normally meant in a formation to guide all the other or the rest of the row behind, right? So that's the main objective of artillery. That is not accurate enough even to attack other artillery. It was considered kind of a waste of fire. So there is all a kind of, 18th century warfare, I think it's some of the most intuitive you can find, historically speaking. I don't know, I have this impression, I haven't quite checked it yet, because it's actually more complicated than one that happened before, but it's relatively easy to understand, I believe. But in here, infantry has a big importance, and naturally as an infantry now that is fully ordered, is trained to perform certain tactics, but at the same time owes its effectiveness to this large front where they can't shoot, right? So even the idea of making more complex maneuvers with infantry is not quite a great one, because at the end of the day, even the success of infantry is obtained as as the core of these armies, by the way. So if you want to wipe an enemy army out, you have to annihilate its infantry. It's the core of its strength. Is effectively sticking together in an orderly fashion, reloading under enemy fire, maintaining formation, shooting these volleys one by one, and basically killing each other in that way. In 18th century warfare, it's musket fire that causes the greatest losses ever. So it's not cavalry. it's not it's not artillery. This armies, in my opinion, but I could be wrong about this, also had a kind of a were kind of more flexible in their retreats usually. The essentials, however, how an army routes and can get pursued, and but it remains the same. But the point of the story is that, especially from at the beginning of the 18th century, these armies were relying at this point on mass, right? The great French campaigns on the Rhineland, in Flanders, in Italy had brought in Germany, had brought to the necessity of having these mega coalitions against France that could field massive armies that could counter the French ones that were enormous normally because of all the French demographic and agricultural strength. So conflicts like even the wars of Spanish succession was the biggest one, the bloodiest one in the first half of the 18th century, were revolving around this this kind of massive bloodbaths, battles to which literally tens of thousands would die, and one would turn to be casualty in one clash, but that fielded so many troops at once that it was kind of impossible to coordinate them properly, right? So there had been this this problem at the beginning of the century in the first place to cope with this armor race, we can say, that looked more like an iron arm competition than an actual fight, right? Because it was not about inflicting the heaviest blow to the enemy in a kind of a refined and precise way. It was probably the best way that armies could operate by certain standards, but at the same time there was still inflection of numbers of troops on the field, for which the main powers said at the end of the day, what, we have to resize, we have to invest maybe a bit more of quality in training and technology and knowing how to operate it. So 18th century warfare, however, had remained a bit too staged in this sense, meaning that even the increasing quality had brought, paradoxically, not to a further dynamicization of warfare, but in a certain sense to a sort of sclerotization. That is to say, armies have just to perform this automatic maneuvers, right? That it's all about which warfare consists. All of which warfare consists. Now, here we open a huge digression because there is all a historiographical prejudice about this. As you know, I'm a medievalist, so I don't know excessively much about modern warfare, but from one side you have this interpretation. I mean, the interpretation that the 18th century warfare was about really fielding this mannequin troops that would just perform everything in a perfectly synchronized fashion, that were all, to which really the quality of the battlefield was measured by the idleness that you had as a soul, as an individual, the blind obedience that you had. Indeed, discipline was massively increased. Like, discipline was pretty damn harsh. And the Prussian army of the second half of the 18th century was regarded as, the best into this. But it was regarded the best into this also at the cost of massive losses. Like during the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, it was basically the most important conflict of the 18th century, aside from, say, the end of the century in itself, and the Revolutionary Wars. So the Prussian armies, having this kind of fanatic attitude of remaining under enemy fire, for example, having to perform those drill maneuvers that were meant to maintain kind of millimetric order between the formations to make it a proof of their discipline, right? Which meant that in certain situations, for example, these troops moved at the same fixed pace even when they were under fire, even if they had run, and even losing cohesion would have overwhelmed the enemies by sheer numbers. Instead were repelled maybe because they waited, because they had to march that same step they had been trained. So something very stubborn, something very fanatic. From the other side, however, there is this idea that even this picture has been a bit too idealized, meaning that it's obvious that when you study actual sources about 18th century warfare, you notice that the average cohesion of these formations was pretty, was not always high. The soldiers would often not march at the same pace. They would often break, they would often charge, they would often run. Simply because it's obvious. I mean, sometimes you need just to fall back in one position fast, and you don't give a damn, whether you have to keep formation. There is a functionality in the process. So this picture that was seen indeed, even in the second half of the 18th century, not just in Prussia, but also in other countries, a certain evolution of tactics in pretty substantial fashion. Even artillery, think about Grübeval. Without Grübeval and its artillery reforms, there would have not been Napoleon, basically. So even in here, Napoleonic traditions owes sometimes really a lot, and meaning really a lot, to the Ancien Régime one. Napoleonic armies without the century-old military tradition and Martinet culture would have not existed, right? So it's important to stress the political and social, let's say, discontinuities, but at the same time, it's also important to assess that what happens in theory, that at this time it started being produced on a quite a larger scale now, with a substantial degree of theorization, is still different what happens on the battlefield, right? So I promise in the future I will study more in depth into this, two sides of the red, right? Of reading the story, right? But however, the general concept is indeed that because this was really the conception that von Clausewitz in part was criticizing, it's the concept of internal lines, right? Is this idea that war can be interpreted just like a set of geometrical relations, right? And the concept is very seducing, and you've got to admit that on a level, it does work, but it's not everything. There are many other levels in war. That's what von Clausewitz points out, and that's where the genius comes from, and that demolishes that perspective objectively. But if you see it from a sheer tactical point of view, right? That is what von Clausewitz is talking about now. You realize that. It's pretty damn obvious. You have certain lines of men who fire muskets. It's essentially it, right? Yeah, okay, you have cavalry on the flanks, you have artillery that soften up the enemy ranks, but basically most of what you have from the other side is specular, right? At least if you talk about clashes between Westerners, European armies were pretty much the same. And therefore the concept in there is that when technology like firearms technology, training, etc., is becoming so homogeneous, the real which was being objectively, at least at an operational level, what you immediately think with a certain degree of abstraction, that's what really eventually backfires in this sense, is thinking that you can solve tactical problems simply by studying the terrain and thinking of certain dispositions of the troops. That is to say, if I put those two companies, like those two regiments, let's say, with this angle, I can concentrate more fire to this angle that is formed by the fire range, and then I have to deploy it. So all these geometrical constructions that obviously they do make sense by certain standards, but they do not take into account a lot of other things. So hence where that obsession for order and maneuver in an orderly fashion in general comes from, because the idea is that as long as you keep these troops perfectly in line, in formation, you can maximize the fire effect, musketry fire, which is as we've seen, the one that causes the most damage on the battlefield. It basically ensures you victory, right? So that has to do also with the rate of fire, etc. So this meant that obviously the more the formation is compact, the more you have an ordered line, the more the effect on the enemy formations is homogeneous and effective. So that's where much of military theory had stopped to, and that was what even thinkers like Jomini were thinking about, even during the Napoleonic Wars, right? Von Clausewitz criticizes this because he says, yeah, this is true. Nobody wants to say that, if you catch an enemy from different fire angles, you obtain different results. Pretty obvious. The problem is, what if there's no visibility? What if there's something in the middle? What if the ground is different from what you expected before you sent that unit in there? What if that unit is less trained than one other? What if that unit is less fed than one other? What if that unit gets a false report? So all that this idea of interior lines goes to vanish, because it becomes virtually insignificant in front of many other factors, elements that intervene regularly in warfare to mess the thing up. At the point it becomes insignificant, and therefore the military thinker has to think of all these aspects of war if he wants to pretend to make something about them, and always bearing in mind that it's basically impossible to know everything what is going on, but literally everything, and it's, if you're lucky, just 1/4 of what is going on for real. So the Napoleonic Wars were a terribly important ground for thinking in this way, because the Napoleonic Wars had in part demolished, and especially Napoleonic tactics and in general, had demolished this sort of overly obsessed, say, order obsessed military thinking. The Napoleon was famous for even many cavalry charges that were completely clumsy, carried out in situations were totally chaotic. Think about the Battle of Eylau. Think about, but there's plenty of examples. That, however, they seemed based basically on sheer force and not much of tactical refinedness, but that effectively made a difference, right? So many criticized Napoleon in this sense, saying, he was just reverting to sheer strength and not on the sophistication of order and kind of millimetrically conceived actions. Well, it doesn't take a military genius to understand that instead, if you have a card that you can play at the right moment, and that it doesn't matter how dirty or useless it can appear. If you use it, you're gonna obtain the damn effect. Well, it's going to be fine. Obviously, this doesn't absolutely mean that Napoleon didn't have an immensely sophisticated and advanced and incredible understanding of what was happening on the battlefield, and he made extremely sensible and calm choices based on really a very complex thought. But it still means that war, in this sense, can't be just about how orderly you keep a formation. It has to be about how effective what you do is, at the end of tactics, that is to win the battle, to win the fight, right? So this is important, and this is in many ways the deepest vein that von Clausewitz is criticizing on that way of thinking. And you can get this from this last phrase, because he says, formations and orders of battle, movable only by the word of command, is intended to unwind its activities like a piece of clockwork, right? So in this conception, what you basically have is the idea that you can, that von Clausewitz is criticizing, of course, that you can dispose of all your tactical choices, your tactical options, and your tactical solutions, more than else, by unwinding the tactical activities contained in a machine, right? It's as if, a machine was capable of contrasting any other threat without having to, to think about how it has to be employed. That's really a problem. That's really a thing. That's really what is probably one of the greatest difficulties in understanding warfare even today. I mean, it's this idea you have just one factor or a set of factors that you can dispose wherever you like so that you can win. It's this idea that you can positivistically do what the hell you want, that you can understand what the hell you want without limitations. With the idea that there is always the solution, that you can always find it, that you're gonna always win, you're always gonna make it, you're gonna always survive, because it just takes a guy who's tough enough to do that, right? Or experienced enough to do it. Experience is crucial, but the sad truth is that you can't always win, by definition, actually. And you're actually going to lose pretty often, telling the truth. There are many, let's say, considerations that we could do at this point in this specific topic, but it's obvious that the general concept is very clear. Like, it's about starting to understand even the history of tactics, as von Clausewitz explains them here, not as a history of strength, but a history of intelligence, right? A history of how to think history history and war, so military history, in the first place, which is what today we don't do. And the point is that you can't have a strategic culture, or a tactical one for that matter, without studying von Clausewitz, so without acknowledging what the things that von Clausewitz points out, that he, observes from reality, and without making an intellectual effort about it, right? That's a real problem. And it's this over-reliance on the magic, of the problem solver, of the weapon that solves the problem, that gives. And I'm not saying that you have to use really every element in here. Even technology is important, but it's still a matter of how you employ this means, and the only way to know how to employ this means is theory. Theory meant not excluding practice, but theory meant as something you have to think through in order to make work, not to feel, not to pretend, because the cool thing about war is that it doesn't wait for you to understand that. And problems and defeats and disasters happen all the time. All right. And today we concentrated on tactics. That is not difficult to how we highlighted. You can imagine what strategy is about. I mean, strategy is really the realm, not of the completely unknown, of course, but as you know, strategic analysis are dramatically overly complicated, else in here you never get to reality as it is, and especially things change drastically. It's this presumption of take strategical analysis about the world. Where are the next conflicts gonna fight? I mean, there are people who study a lifetime. There's enormous resources the governments employ rightfully, because they want to understand how how threats for their national security are gonna take place, for which dynamics, how they can contain them. And the deep realization of this is also that you can't take this problem seriously if you don't study politics and society before war, right? It's not about having, a closed country where you have a military that can deal with violence and you're done. At this point, war is fought even on the internet. It's fought through means that are not even material, right? I mean, they are material, but you can't quite. They're not really what had existed up to a few decades ago. There is our world is increasingly more complicated, and it's a complete mess to figure out and to sort out and to explore. So for everyone who thinks that everything is easy, or that you need just those two things to believe or to pretend that they are true, for whatever thing about morality, about politics, about life, just know that you are really making a very human thing that is obviously radically underestimating your possibilities, but at the same time, in fact, making a great, mistake. Because if you don't take it, nobody tells you that you have to fight until you know everything, because nobody can evenly, but that you at least make something about it. The real problem, so that you improve relatively your knowledge. So, and actually, in absolute terms, your knowledge. The problem here is when, and this is seemingly a prevalent attitude that we seem to be having now at this point, is the attitude of saying, since we can't know things, what do we learn for? Right? This thing is so complicated, it doesn't even make sense for me to make a change. Well, it's not really, that's exactly when your enemy is gonna defeat you, because you're basically leaving the initiative to the enemy. You're telling to the enemy, look, I'm weak, I lowered the guard because I don't care anymore. It's like, remember that everything that ends in ism is the best way to make a military mistake in general. Always. That's why with dogmatism, that can comprehend all of these ideas, that things are the way they are, because at one point of my life I decided that I can't say I understood everything about this thing. Nobody in his or her own life can stop learning about one thing, right? And not even knowing to be, not even being the best, the greatest expert in that specific topic is actually understanding reality. And that's where, and the result, we could talk endlessly. Now I cut it off because it's a bit too long. But the concept is, there are people who are paying others to give up. And this is how the next frontier of politics and society is really about. That people stop caring about their own rights, about their own duties, about their own responsibilities, because it's too annoying, man. It's too boring, it's too hard, right? If I can't pay for someone else to think it to be, well, this is very risky. And it's natural from one side, because obviously, at this point we have to expect society to evolve in this fashion. Or maybe I am too pessimist, I don't know. Maybe people in the future will be so more aware, but it doesn't seem so, right? It seems on the contrary to me that people got dumped down, and not just because they are there were on average dumber people. Maybe it's not even about, it's not really about the absolute levels of ignorance. I do believe that people today are less ignorant than before. The problem is emulation. The problem is that before people could be more ignorant, but at least they were trained to sort out things a bit by themselves, seemingly, or at least they had their own sphere of, of interactions that brought them to take decision firsthand by themselves, and that therefore kind of taught them what it means to make a choice rather than another, and to think at life in this practical ways, pragmatic ways. Today, instead, you connect to the internet and all you see is someone who says something, and you're automatically sucked into that, and your perspective at that point is not making an autonomous decision, but either sticking to one thing you see and another thing you see, and not looking at other things you can kind of figure out by yourself, right? I know it's a kind of a simplistic ideal, because obviously humans have always kind of learned by looking at others or listening to others, being convinced by others and all this stuff. But it seems that today the potential for mistake is, or maybe not the potential for mistake, but the let's say the intelligibility of this process is gonna be blurred. Right, that there are gonna be problems regarding the ability of people to reason autonomously on the base of what they have. They always need someone who solves the problem for them, that gives the answer for them, right? And this intrinsic feeling of that you have your shell where everything supposedly is going fine, is separated from the rest of the world, and therefore you can also not care about the rest of the world. Well, it can't be like that. And caring for the rest of the world, that doesn't really mean anything like what you have to do with the world. You can hate the world for all you're concerned, like having your plan to in fact, doing even kind of negative things. I don't know. The problem, though, is more pretending that you're not part of this reality, and that therefore you can treat everything like a game, and not as something that is based on your actual decision. And I know we live in a way in which personalities are kind of getting of a lower profile, of a kind of more homogeneous character, but that's what is easy for who has a bit more of an understanding to play on, right? And that's, you see, what even scams today are about. They seem to be based on kind of barely intelligent, barely mature people, because probably most of the people are like that, but also because they're kind of easy to trick. Even maybe if they're intelligent, they can't see what all the others do and being convinced to take that decision. And it's always been like that, also historically speaking. Like, there's never been a moment in which people were not exploited by more cunning, but at the same time it was less margin for unseen, unperceived exploitation. Instead, today people do not even realize when they're exploited. And when they let themselves willingly be exploited. Look at the internet. I'm not making a broader, terrible social pole. I don't care about, I don't even use that kind of vocabulary. I'm talking look at how the internet works. We depend on certain dictates that nobody fundamentally has agreed on, but you just follow in line, because otherwise you can't log to your Facebook account, right? So you're able to say, okay, well, yeah, I will pay you this, I don't care, just as long as you make me do what I feel, which is kind of normal, also economically speaking. But I believe that there is also a capacity of intervening psychologically on certain people's mind to in fact, to make, some... Well, okay, I want to hope that it's not really like that. I want to hope that the awareness of this problem will be reached at a satisfactory level soon. I'm just saying that as far as I'm concerned, most people don't seem concerned about the problem, or even if they are, they're not very loud about it, or they don't find the right spaces for speaking up. And this is gonna be a problem. And there are certain things about how, in terms of social control, that are starting to happen that nobody seemingly cares much about. Because maybe there is another new that is much more bizarre, but ultimately also much less influent, that is maybe shouted, and everybody looks at that, and in the meanwhile there are like hundreds of other things you don't even know anything about, because you don't hear them, because they don't tell it to you, that they just pass unnoticed, so that the person obviously that suffers from that realizes it, but when it's too late. Whatever, this all starting from what von Clausewitz thought about tactics in modern age, well, whatever. But it has to do with that, because it's a continuous line, right? It's not just about war, it's about really how the entire human experience is, right? Whatever, for now I just stop it. And I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.